Hi, this is Hilton, freshly back from Tech Ed South Africa. It was a bit of an interesting, tricky Tech Ed for me, especially with prepping and the new baby at home and things like that, but I think it went okay. My talk on Moss Enterprise Search seemed to go down really well. I got one comment that it was the best Tech Ed session this person had ever seen, so that was pretty cool. Also managed to record a couple of episodes while I was there, 2 panel discussions and 1 episode with Eric Harlan. I was supposed to record 1 episode with Joel Olsen while he was down, but we just couldn't find a time to record it all. But I'm hoping to put him down while he's actually visiting here in Cape Town over the course of the weekend. So we'll see how that goes. It's also going to be the SharePoint Saturday event down here for the information worker community, which is going to be Joel and Eric pretty much spending the entire day sharing a whole bunch of very cool sessions. So this show will probably only come out after that. But if you were there, I hope you had a great session. And if not, then look out for the next one. We're hoping to have a few more of those coming up. I also mentioned in the last episode that I'll be visiting London later this month for a couple of days, and it looks like I'll have a little bit of time during one of the days if anyone wants me to come and visit their company and talk about anything SharePoint related. Should be a fun trip either way, though. I haven't been in London, at least not touring, for a couple of years, so we'll see if I can find something interesting that catches my fancy to do during the days there in the free time. I'm going to keep a bit of a shorter intro this time. Everybody comes back from Tech Ed with plastic toys and cups and pens and squeezy balls. I seem to have come back with the flu, so we're going to have a shorter intro and going to jump straight into part 2 of the episode with Sahil Malik. The first part is available in the archives on the website at www.TheMossShow.com, so go ahead and check out the archives to get that first part of the episode. And this episode concludes the discussion that Sahil and I had on developing with SharePoint. It even includes some interesting philosophical advice from Sahil at the end of the episode, so look out for that as well. And let's go ahead and enjoy the episode.
I was proud and I was standing. I was lost in a crowd. But now this room
I think that, as you say, really boils down to the judgment call. You've got to base it on the environment and on the users. I've got an example of both sides of that coin. We put a system together recently for a client, and we needed a certain type of data stored in a list in order to facilitate some of the functionality.
Right.
But once the users saw what was capable just working within that list, and the fact that they could go and customize the metadata and change the views and things like that, they realized that they had in their hands the power of a system that they hadn't been able to achieve a few years before,
right,
over a long protracted period.
Right.
While at the same time, I've heard you yourself say that the more features you give to a user, the more maintenance hassle you have.
Well, yeah. I mean, every IT project is represented with a simple mathematical formula, which is the number of users multiplied by what those users can do is equal to your headache.
So in SharePoint, there's a lot they can do.
That's the thing. There's a lot that they can do. So when you roll out a new project, trim it down first and open it up gradually with training. Training is very important.
Do you have some examples of the things you typically turn off?
Well, yeah. As an example, things that rely on ActiveX controls, I like to turn those off initially. Examples. And there may be differing opinions, and that's fine, but this is what I like to do. That Explorer view, in which you can throw stuff into a document library, I like to give that view out to users as an exception, not the rule. There are 2 reasons for that. One, if I give it out to one person, the other person will ask for it too, whether or not they need it. But let's say that you have a document library in which you have that Explorer view, and the document library requires you to put in some metadata. Now, if you upload a document through the document library, through the UI, the next screen it will give you is the metadata that you need to provide, and especially the required fields. Whereas in the Explorer view, you can throw a bunch of documents in there, and then you have to go and put metadata in those one by one. There is no enforcement that allows the user to not go away from that screen without providing the required metadata. So, but of course, the user is just going to throw in the documents, and over time what you're going to have is a bunch of documents with missing required metadata. Not to mention that there'll be this guy running on a Mac, and he loves a Mac, and he's not going to give up his dear Mac for anything, and he wants that Explorer view. And because it's an ActiveX control, it won't work on his Mac. Or somebody is coming from an extranet scenario, and they cannot use AD authentication. And bingo, again, you're stuck with that Explorer view that you cannot provide to this end user. Or just because it's an ActiveX control, and because some DLLs are messed up on somebody's computer, and that Explorer view just hangs. And good luck debugging that on one person's computer, except that one person is like the CEO of the company, and he's got a loud mouth, and so it'll create hassles for you. Now, it is a powerful tool. I'm not saying don't use it, but with power comes responsibility, and you just have to be careful of who you open up these things to.
Okay, that's an interesting rule of thumb in terms of the ActiveX. I like that idea. What's your take on something like My Sites, for example?
My Sites are very nice, actually. I like My Sites. When SharePoint was new, a lot of people said, "Oh, don't touch My Sites. There's too many sites. It's like bunnies, and it's too much to maintain. How many sites?" But the reality is, site is just data, and it's just data. It's easy to back up. It's a site, okay, but it's just data, really. It's in the database. So I personally love My Sites, but before I roll My Sites out to an enterprise, I would have a chat with the business users, and I'll ask them, do you need any customizations on this My Site before we roll it out to the world? Because applying after the fact customizations is going to be hard. And invariably, users will say, yeah, in our organization, it makes sense to have this web part on the My Site that talks to the backend SAP database and gives the user his current list of tasks, for instance, right? And so this is one of the chats that I like to have with end users before I roll out My Sites. But when you roll out My Sites, I just think it is such a powerful concept that that you can provide a user with. See, one of the things with SharePoint is that it's too many sites. There are so many sites in any typical SharePoint installation. There are so many sites, and it is unreasonable for us to expect the user to bounce between these millions of sites to find what they need to do. It's not that discoverable. And to make it discoverable, it's really the My Site, which is the perfect place because there's a link to My Site on anywhere you go inside of SharePoint. The user can get to his comfort zone by clicking on the My Site link. And if we are able to provide functionality in the My Site that points him to all these other things that the user can discover. So I think My Site is extremely valuable, but you have to roll it out with planning. You don't just roll it out.
Okay, so yeah, I'll come back to the point you were making originally, I guess, that all the features can be useful, but plan them, manage them appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like one particular feature that I like a lot is InfoPath. We talked a little bit about it earlier. I don't know why more people don't use it, but as an example, writing an ASPX for SharePoint is a royal pain because the code behind doesn't work, and you put stuff in the GAC, and you don't get a visual UI. Now, all of that picture can be made a lot simpler with InfoPath, but the challenge with InfoPath is how do you deploy it? How do you, really get the developer out of the loop on it, that a business user can, through point and click, create a reasonable form that will pass the rigors of time, version control, and all that stuff, and allow them to be able to create this nice-looking UI in SharePoint with InfoPath forms. And it's doable. It is. And I wrote a little piece of code that allows you to do exactly that basically the business user would craft up an InfoPath form, publish it to a network location, give it to the administrator so they can upload it in central admin and activate that form on a site collection, then drop a web part, point it to the form, and the form appears running inside the browser in the SharePoint site. And in all this process, you didn't have to involve a developer at all. So I'm thinking of writing an article on that and codeplexing some code around this scenario to make this process more seamless. But I just think InfoPath is a fantastic way to give nice-looking UIs inside of SharePoint, edit UIs inside of SharePoint.
So you've touched on a point then, we can get into the whole debate of customization versus development, but something I'd like to pick up just because we haven't discussed it too much in the show, and it's something that you mentioned yourself in terms of things like continuous integration and test-driven development. One of the things this client yesterday mentioned to me, and I mentioned I'd bring him up again. I thought it might come up in the show. The company that had delivered the solution, he said he's not a SharePoint guy. He doesn't know much about SharePoint, but he's got an old Delphi history. So something was just not feeling right in his gut around the deployment of this solution. Basically, the deployment came down to the developers logging onto the live production environment, creating lists with, making sure they got the names exactly correct to what the UAT looked like and the dev environment looked like, creating the columns with also the same names and the same types. You know the kind of story, doing everything by hand.
Yeah.
What's the answer that I can tell this client? Is that the way you have to develop in SharePoint?
Okay. Again, the answer is yes and no. So let me. It's a gray scale. It's not black or white. I typically what I like to say is that if you are going to create an artifact that you ever need to program against in the future, you probably want to deploy that using code. So that's fine. We'll write code, and you can write code to create a list. You can write code to create a document library. But then the question is, writing code is increasing the hassle of creating a larger code base that you'll have to maintain down the road, and also it is more things that you have to test, more things you have to maintain, and it's just expensive to write code. So typically what I like to do is that unless you're dealing with sensitive data, it is okay to give the developer site collection admin rights to the site collection in V1, the first release. And the developer has the ability to go deploy features, activate features, create a list, and so on and so forth. And then be able to connect his custom code with things that he created through the browser. So it's okay to do some things through the browser because it's going to save you massive amounts of time and money. The exceptions to this rule are, example, creating content types. Content types are something that, unless it's a use and throw content type that I know I will never ever care about, content types are something that I always like to deploy through code. You can easily create them through point and click, but I just like to do them through code. The reason being, content types, the IDs of those content types are very important. And it is very important to keep those IDs consistent amongst all your environments. As an example, you're writing a workflow. The workflow has custom tasks. And those custom tasks is a create task activity. And the create task activity expects a content type ID. Now, if you did not have the same content type ID between your development environment and your production environment, you cannot write a workflow that will reliably work in one environment and definitely work in the other one as well. So content type IDs are something that I like to control and I like to have consistent IDs for. Another example could be when you have lists. Now you can create a list instance through the browser. It'll give you a GUID. Now, if there is a very extreme borderline scenario where you need to know that you're accessing the lists or number of lists very, very quickly, and performance is very important here. So it'll help you if you knew those IDs of all those lists in advance. So you want to control the IDs. But that is such a borderline scenario that for the most part, you can create a list instance either through code or through the browser. But I typically don't find myself, if there's one list instance that I want to create, it's okay to take that shortcut and just go create it through the browser. But if I'm writing a feature and I want to, and this feature is going to do 3 or 4 things, and one of those things is a list instance, what the hell? Add a list instance tag in your element.xml and you're done. But I wouldn't write one feature for one list that I need to deploy is my point. So it's just an overkill.
Yeah. Are we talking about...
Oh, can I actually add something else to that?
Okay.
Now, whenever you're writing new code into SharePoint, part of it is what you do on the site collection, and part of it is what you do in central admin or the SSP. Because, let's say you're deploying something to Excel services, you want to add a trusted location. That goes in the SSP. Any changes that need to go in the SSP or central admin, I typically like to address them by giving them build notes and a document with clear instructions rather than code that is touching your central admin. And there are two reasons for this. One, there are just two sites that you need to affect. It's not something that you're going to have to replicate reliably over hundreds and hundreds of sites, right?
Okay.
And the second reason is there is so much that you can do in central admin. If I write the instructions and give it to somebody, then I can blame somebody else if it goes bad, Because if it was code, then it's entirely my fault. And code, let's face it, when it enters a loop and it can do something really wacky, it's hard to stop it in time. So it would have done a lot more damage. One of the phrases I like to use a lot is computers are just tools that let you make a lot of mistakes very quickly. So that's another, in Central, if you want to do some point-and-click configuration, you just handle those as build notes and just give them to the user who's deploying your solutions. And that approach works fairly well.
That's interesting. A lot of the guidance really says features and WSPs or nothing. But you're saying, take a dose of reality in there and kind of look at what you're doing.
Yeah, I think we're headed back to the Michael Jackson discussion. But really, you have to take a little dose of reality that, yes, features and solution to deploy custom code, but you don't create a list item using a feature. There's a gray area over there which comes into actually using SharePoint, that you're creating a list, you're creating a list item, and the boundary between what is deployment and what is actually using the platform, and there are some fuzzy boundaries there. And again, if there's something that you need to do repeatable over a number of sites or site collections, chances are code is a better way to go. If it is content type and content type IDs that you'd like to maintain, code is a better way to go. But if it's creating a list and you need to create one list to support your feature, it's okay. Just go ahead and create that from the UI. It's all right.
I want to clarify one thing you raised there about multiple sites. That may be multiple sites in the same environment, but it may also be multiple environments that you're pushing something through, dev to testing to pre-production to production, that sort of thing.
That is true. But again, if it's just one single list item or list that you want to create, and this feature depends on one list, do you write a brand new feature for that one list, or do you just include list instance in your existing feature, or you just create the list instance by hand? I'd say just go with whichever is the least effort. It's okay.
Okay.
So,
Sahil, let's go back right to the beginning. Something that you raised earlier on that I'd like to touch on. You mentioned that test-driven development and continuous integration are certainly possible with SharePoint. Can you give a developer, if you've got a developer who's starting up with this kind of stuff, some guidance on how to get started? What makes it different, and what kind of lessons would they need and tools would they need to know about?
Let me actually shorten a couple of URLs for you, in which I've expressed my opinions about SharePoint and TDD and all that stuff. So let's go to tinyURL, sitting in front of my computer right now, and I'm going to shorten this up. And so there is an article I wrote about in which I expressed my opinions about SharePoint and TDD, which is tinyurl.com/nbkj3z. nbkj3z.
That's Z for anybody living in certain English-speaking countries.
That's true. Z. And what I said in that article is that the SharePoint API. Okay, in a typical SharePoint project, you have a lot of things that you spend effort on. And I'm comparing a typical SharePoint project with the .NET project. You have a greater emphasis on customer communication and prototyping. You have a greater emphasis on the IT pro and the database side of things. You have a higher amount of effort on branding or scalability. And you also write some code. You have a greater effort spent towards establishing clean roles in your team and training and architecture and functionality bargaining is what I like to call it. So the writing code portion is smaller in a typical SharePoint project than it is in a typical .NET project. In fact, as I mentioned earlier in the show, my emphasis in any SharePoint project is to write as little code as possible anyway. Now, the little code that you're writing, so you're already talking about a smaller percentage of the project that code is applicable to, .NET code is applicable to. Now, in that smaller piece of code, the SharePoint API is not the best when it comes to creating some mock objects. There are a lot of sealed classes and stuff that doesn't lend itself well to TDD. So typically, it is more effort to do TDD for SharePoint for a lesser return. Right? There is a smaller portion of your project you will affect because of TDD. Now, there are projects out there which are mostly custom dev. And if TDD is what suits you there, go for it. But I'm saying in a typical business environment, SharePoint project, you don't want to write a lot of code. You want to avoid writing code. So TDD is harder. The return is lesser. So TDD is lesser applicable to SharePoint than it is to a regular .NET project, in my opinion. However, because TDD is a good practice, it lets you write better, more maintainable code in the longer run. And because this is a tool that is less available to you in SharePoint, your reliance on other tools increases. Continuous integration, for instance, or automated builds. You can very easily write scripts, PowerShell scripts, or even .bat files that deploy stuff to SharePoint on a nightly basis, for instance. And that will ensure that your code is at a certain level of quality every night, every evening. So other mechanisms of ensuring clean code and a better or more maintainable SharePoint development environment, you tend to rely on those more, and you have to pay attention to those more because tools such as TDD are not very well available to you. Now, if I can, let me pimp another URL. Is it okay to pimp other podcasts on this in this podcast?
As long as they're mostly clean. Depends how much they mention Michael Jackson.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is kind of clean. I hope so. So there is another DNR TV. This is actually a video cast that I recorded with Carl Franklin. It's at tinyurl.com/MSBZFO, in which I demo a way of developing for SharePoint where I segregate my functionality and I develop 90% of it outside of a virtual machine on a Vista machine. And then I take pieces out of it and deploy those into SharePoint, sort of package it up into a space shuttle and deploy it into SharePoint.
And for those who don't have access here, this is focused a lot on Silverlight particularly.
This particular, that's right. And what I demo in there is that the ability to work with your custom business objects with possibly custom intelligence in them. And when you're working with your own custom business objects and you've abstracted a layer between you and SharePoint, that you've created this API layer between yourself and the SharePoint API, then all of those nice things that the regular .NET developers use, like hit F5 when a breakpoint gets hit, all of those things become available to a SharePoint developer. And then you can start introducing scenarios like mock objects, TDD, or whatever else you want.
Okay, so that's an interesting take. Try and, where you can, abstract the SharePoint out of it if you do need that kind of capability.
Right. Create an abstraction layer. It's just becomes so much more testable if you do that. Not to mention, developing in a VM is not a lot of fun. Especially when you're developing for Silverlight, you have Blend, you have Visual Studio, you have IS, MOS, SQL Server, everything running on one virtual machine. And going forward with vNext, it's going to be a 64-bit VM. The RAM requirements are going to be higher. Developing in a VM is not my idea of a good time, really. But with SharePoint, we have to do it. Now, when you develop, do you develop on a physical machine or on a VM?
Yeah, we're also doing VMs. I guess that's pretty much across the board. But it's not a problem these days. So here we all got 8 gigs of RAM in our laptops these days. Quad core.
Aha. Okay. That is true. But see, when you go to a 64-bit VM, which you'll have to do with the next version of SharePoint, with 64-bit operating system, your memory becomes much more fragmented. And therefore, even though you have 4 gigs, it feels like you're working on a machine that has 2.5 gigs on a VM. Because the memory is simply more spatial. Just if you on a 64-bit SharePoint 2007 or a 32-bit SharePoint 2007, create a blank site, HTTP to it, see how much memory does a W3 WP exe consumes. And you'll find that on one it is about 80K, on the other one it's about 250K. for the same operation. It's not because it actually needs 250K. It's just because the memory is much more fragmented and spatial.
Yeah, and I think just outside of the memory, I mean, that's going to hit us either way with the 64-bit VMs. But outside of that, I mean, of course, I'm joking about the hardware specs, but, regardless of what you're doing, working on a VM is going to be slower, as you say.
Correct. Absolutely. Working with a VM versus just hit an IS reset and deploy. And when I show this in demos, we've gotten so used to working in VMs, and I agree laptops have gotten a lot better since SharePoint 2007 came out. We've gotten desensitized to the pain, or we've forgotten the pleasure of working on a physical machine. If you can work on a physical machine, hands down, any day, it's better. Even with VMware, you can take advantage of only 2 cores. With virtual PC, it's just 1 core. The virtual PC, you Control-Shift-B and try switching to the Output tab. So you can see what your batch file is doing, and it just freezes up. It's hard to even do that. Whereas on a real physical machine, it's just so much nicer to work. I think it makes a big difference. Like if somebody pings you with a problem, what do you do? Boot up a VM, and it's a 15-minute warm-up time before you get to write code. Whereas if it's a physical machine, click, click, done. It's so much easier.
Are we going to see the story improving at all with Windows 7, do you think?
Well, I'm certainly hoping so. With Windows 7, you have the ability to mount a VHD as a drive. So what that lets you do is that it'll let you boot a VM, which is a VHD, as a physical machine, right?
Yeah.
And so basically you're running a VM. I mean, you have the convenience of a VM. You can back it up and all that stuff. But you're running it like a physical machine. So I think there's still that warm-up time issue that because you're going to have to reboot your laptop. You can either run the VHD or you can run your host OS. So you're still going to run into that issue of the warm-up issues, but you still have at least it'll run faster. At least you'll have the experience of running on a physical machine while taking the advantage. So it's going to get a little bit better, and I'm very anxiously waiting for it to run a VHD on an SSD on Windows 7. I'm very anxiously waiting for that.
Yeah, look, but that said, we're still not going to quite have the same kind of F5 experience that we have with ASP.NET.
That's true, because there are other issues, but it'll get better. Tiny strokes fell great oaks. Yeah, but actually, I think Windows 7 is going to RTM on July 13th. I hear that's about less than 2 weeks away, and I actually put in an order for a 256 gigabyte SSD, and I'm going to try that running VHD on an SSD on a physical as a physical machine. And I'll blog about it. I'll tell you how it goes. I'm hoping it'll be good, but I'll tell you how it goes.
Yeah, I'm going to watch your blog eagerly. I'm keen to see how that goes.
So, yeah, me too. Me too, absolutely. I'll watch my blog too.
Eagerly.
Eagerly.
So here we're running out of time, yes. So maybe can I ask you, are there any other last words you'd give to somebody maybe launching into SharePoint development or even a seasoned SharePoint developer? You might want to leave with some advice or some tips.
Yes. The tip I'd like to give is all developers that are listening to this show is that we live a very unhealthy lifestyle. And our culture is based on how less you can sleep and how much coffee you can drink. So I'm going to say something interesting, that in the next 20 years, 1 out of every 4 of you would have suffered a heart attack. And doesn't matter what you're developing on, doesn't matter what you're doing, focus on your life and don't live this unhealthy lifestyle. If your job pushes you to work late nights and whatnot, find a new job. It's not worth your health.
I think those are quite interesting closing words. I was expecting some kind of right-click in Visual Studio sort of tip, but those are good words. I agree with you there very much. I think one of the things I've strived for in recent years is to try and make sure that my teams are finishing, working sort of 8 to 5, and not 8 to 8.
It's not worth your health. It's not worth your health.
Yeah, so hopefully SharePoint can help us achieve those kind of dreams and work normal hours like normal people.
Virtualizing SharePoint properly will improve your real life.
That's a good tip to close on. Sahil, thanks again for your time. I think we've got through some interesting tips, and it's certainly been a little bit more of an unusual chat than I thought we'd get to. Michael Jackson aside.
Michael Jackson aside.
So thanks again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Out the window, everybody keep on fading out. Gone out the window, everybody keep on fading out.
If you've got any questions about any of the ideas discussed in this episode, or you'd like to give other feedback, like show topics or requests, then mail us at feedback@TheMossShow.com. To access the archives of all of our shows, browse to www.themossShow.com or www.TheMossShow.com.